By mid-1943, the Second World War had entered a new phase. The Axis tide was visibly turning. On the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht was reeling from its defeat at Stalingrad. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps had surrendered in Tunisia. And in the skies over Europe, American and British bombers were now striking deep into the German Reich. With every new campaign, every enemy surrender, the number of German prisoners of war taken by Allied forces grew rapidly. The United States, unlike the United Kingdom or the Soviet Union, had both the resources and the space to detain large numbers of captured Axis soldiers. Between 1942 and 1946, over 425,000 German POWs were held in camps across the United States. Scattered across nearly every state, these camps ranged from converted civilian conservation corps sites to purpose-built compounds surrounded by barbed wire, watchtowers, and military guards. The largest concentration of prisoners could be found in rural heartland states, Texas, Kansas, Iowa, and Nebraska, where vast distances, open land, and strong wartime patriotism made local populations more amenable to their presence. The legal and moral framework for the treatment of prisoners of war had already been established by the 1929 Geneva Convention, which mandated humane treatment, protection from violence, and even work opportunities for prisoners, so long as those jobs weren't directly tied to the war effort. Unlike the Eastern Front, where German and Soviet forces routinely violated these principles, American military authorities sought to adhere closely to the Convention's guidelines. Their treatment of German POWs, while not perfect, was broadly consistent with international law. But what emerged from this adherence was something more complex. In rural communities across the United States, the labor vacuum created by the draft had emptied farms and factories of their able-bodied workers. American authorities, facing mounting production quotas for food, ammunition, and equipment, began to see the labor potential of captured Germans not just as a legal requirement, but as an economic solution. Through a system of civilian work agreements and under supervision by the War Department, German POWs were allowed, and often encouraged, to work outside the confines of their camps. Many were paid modest wages for their labor, sometimes in camp scrip rather than US dollars, which they could use in camp canteens. Others worked in the fields alongside American civilians. They planted, harvested, repaired equipment, and baled hay. They were driven to and from farms by military trucks, and often they were invited to lunch by the very families whose sons were fighting overseas. To many of these prisoners, especially those who had internalized the Nazi worldview of Allied brutality, this treatment came as a shock. Expecting abuse or hard labor, they instead encountered a society that, while deeply engaged in a global war, made a clear distinction between soldiers and ideologues, between war criminals and conscripts. For some, the experience would alter their understanding of the war and of the United States permanently. Yet this unexpected policy was not without tensions. Local populations were sometimes uneasy. American veterans returning home questioned why the enemy was being fed and housed while their families coped with rationing and loss. Meanwhile, in Washington, lawmakers debated the optics and ethics of placing German soldiers, many of whom had fought in units implicated in atrocities, into the very heart of American communities. Still, by war's end, the American POW program had become a striking, if under-examined, aspect of the home front. It was an episode defined not by violence, but by restraint, not by revenge, but by adherence to principle. A story that reflected not only military policy, but national identity, how a democratic society chose to treat its enemy in captivity. The use of German POWs as laborers in the United States was not simply an act of wartime pragmatism. It was a calculated element of the domestic war strategy. By 1943, over 16 million Americans were serving in the armed forces. The resulting labor shortage on the home front, particularly in agriculture, was acute. farms across the Midwest and South were facing a crisis. Their production was essential to feeding both civilians and troops, but their labor force had been hollowed out. To bridge this gap, the U.S. government implemented a coordinated system of POW labor programs, overseen by the Office of the Provost Marshal General. German prisoners were trucked from their camps to local farms and food processing plants. They worked under guard, but with a surprising degree of routine. In most cases, their labor was organized not ad hoc, but through formalized contracts between the War Department and local businesses or agricultural boards. POWs were legally bound by the Geneva Convention to work, so long as the labor was non-military. In return, they were paid 80 cents per day, typically in canteen currency. For the U.S. government, this amounted to cost-effective labor at a time when maintaining production levels was critical to the global war effort. Technologically, this solution was low-cost and scalable. No new machines were needed, only organization and transportation. In essence, German POWs became a logistical asset. By 1945, nearly half of all POWs in America were working outside their camps, building roads, harvesting wheat, or canning vegetables, contributing directly to the war economy of the nation they had once been sent to destroy. For the average German soldier captured in North Africa or France, arriving in the United States meant a transition from chaos to structure. After often brutal combat and long transits across the Atlantic, they found themselves in a country most had only known through Nazi propaganda. What they encountered was, for many, disorienting. The prison camps were militarily austere but not harsh. Rows of wooden barracks, mess halls, recreation areas, and even libraries were common. Education programs were offered under the Special Projects Division, designed to re-educate prisoners by exposing them to democratic ideas. Religious services were available, and sports were encouraged. Some prisoners formed orchestras, others edited camp newspapers. For many, working on American farms became not just a necessity, but a psychological refuge. Interactions with civilians, while regulated, were often surprisingly cordial. Farmers, especially those of German descent, occasionally spoke the prisoners' language. In some cases, genuine friendships formed. One former POW recalled being invited into a family's home for a Christmas meal, an act he would remember for the rest of his life. Yet the experience was not without emotional weight. Many prisoners felt guilt about their survival, while others endured the slow erosion of ideological certainty. The Nazi worldview, which predicted Allied brutality, found little confirmation in the dusty fields of Kansas or the peach orchards of Georgia. There was also longing. Letters from home were censored and infrequent. News of the war's direction, filtered through camp briefings and rumor, added to a sense of growing helplessness. Behind the apparent calm was a population processing defeat, uncertainty, and transformation. The decision to treat German prisoners humanely was not universally supported within the U.S. military or political establishment, but at the highest levels, it was consistent with American strategic doctrine. General George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, emphasized discipline through order and international law. The Geneva Convention was not only a legal requirement, it was seen as a safeguard. Humane treatment of Axis POWs, it was reasoned, might influence reciprocal treatment of American prisoners held by Germany. Oversight of the entire POW system fell to the Office of the Provost Marshal General, under the leadership of Major General Archer L. Lurch. He and his subordinates worked to maintain a standardized approach across the country. Each camp commander was responsible for ensuring adherence to regulations, and inspections were frequent. But within the wire, German leadership structures were harder to dismantle. Many POW camps replicated Wehrmacht hierarchies internally. Senior non-commissioned officers retained control over discipline and routine as allowed by the Geneva Convention. This autonomy often created tensions. In some camps, hardcore Nazis attempted to enforce ideological conformity, harassing or even assaulting fellow prisoners who showed openness to American values. Several incidents of intra-camp violence prompted U.S. authorities to separate prisoners by ideology. In response, the re-education program, codenamed the Intellectual Diversion Program, was discreetly implemented. It used books, films, and discussion groups to challenge Nazi ideology and prepare selected POWs for post-war democratic life in Germany. It was not overt propaganda, but it was undeniably political. A war of ideas, fought behind fences rather than front lines. The decision to pay, feed, and humanely treat German POWs was not merely administrative. It was moral and strategic. In a war defined by atrocities, the American POW program stood out for its restraint. It contrasted sharply with the brutal conditions in Japanese or Soviet camps, where mistreatment of prisoners was common and often systemic. For American policymakers, maintaining the high ground was not just about morality. It was also about shaping post-war outcomes. These men, it was believed, would return to Germany with memories not of revenge, but of rule of law. And indeed, many former POWs would later become prominent voices in post-war German civic life. Their treatment in captivity had, in some cases, created a foundation of goodwill between former enemies. Yet this policy was not without cost. American civilians at home, especially families who had lost sons in Europe or the Pacific, sometimes viewed the good treatment of prisoners as a betrayal. Newspaper editorials questioned the justice of German soldiers dining on bread and stew, while American homes dealt with ration books and telegrams of loss. The image of able-bodied Germans walking American fields while disabled veterans struggled to find work was politically sensitive. Still, the U.S. held the line. The policy was sustained not out of sympathy, but principle. It was a reflection of what America chose to be, even in war, and in a global conflict where moral lines were often blurred. This quiet chapter stood as an assertion of democratic values under pressure. By 1944, the German prisoner population in the United States had grown dramatically. Following the D-Day, landings in June, and the rapid Allied advances across France, new waves of Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS captives began arriving. Many had been taken in bitter combat and carried with them a harder ideological edge. These were not conscripts from the Eastern Front or North Africa, but men more recently indoctrinated by the Nazi regime, sometimes members of the Hitler Youth generation who had known nothing else. The American authorities at first made little distinction. All POWs were processed through a central intake system, typically beginning at Camp Shanks in New York or Camp Swift in Texas, before being assigned to one of more than 500 branch camps across the country. Here, the cracks began to show. Within the camps, informal command structures emerged. The Geneva Convention allowed enlisted men to maintain internal discipline under their own non-commissioned officers, and many of these NCOs were fiercely loyal to Hitler. They used their authority not just to organize daily routines, but to enforce ideological purity. Fellow prisoners who expressed moderate views, sought to cooperate with American programs, or even showed curiosity about life in a democratic society, were targeted. In several camps, particularly in Camp Aliceville, Alabama, and Camp Concordia, Kansas, there were confirmed reports of intimidation and violence. Prisoners suspected of disloyalty or defeatism were threatened, beaten, or isolated. In the most extreme cases, fellow prisoners were murdered for their perceived betrayal. One such case occurred in September 1944, when Johannes Kunze, a 24-year-old German Navy radioman, was found dead at Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma. Investigation revealed he had been suspected of being an informant for the Americans. He had participated in English lessons, read American newspapers, and shown interest in the re-education materials provided. Fellow prisoners accused him of collaboration. He was beaten and strangled by other POWs in a camp barracks. Kunze's murder shocked local officials, but also laid bare the underlying volatility within the seemingly well-ordered POW system. The incident led to the arrest and conviction of 5 fellow prisoners, all sentenced to death by U.S. military tribunal. They were executed by hanging at Fort Leavenworth in 1945. Following this and other incidents, the War Department altered its approach. The assumption that German prisoners would be passive, cooperative, or easily influenced gave way to a new policy of ideological classification. Camps began separating prisoners by political alignment. Hardcore Nazis from moderates or apolitical soldiers. Intelligence officers conducted interviews, monitored internal communications, and compiled profiles on camp leaders. The war within the wire had begun to mirror the larger conflict. Ideology had crossed the Atlantic not only in uniforms, but in minds. And for American authorities, the realization that a portion of their POW population remained committed enemies, even in captivity, marked a turning point. The system that had once emphasized routine and humane treatment would now have to navigate loyalty, resistance, and political warfare within its own perimeter. In the wake of Johannes Kunz's murder and similar events, the U.S. military could no longer afford to treat the German POW system as a uniform population under manageable control. What had begun as a logistical solution to labor shortages had now become a complex problem of ideology, security, and public perception. A quiet internal war, fought with threats, loyalty, and silence, was unfolding across dozens of camps. The War Department responded with both policy and personnel. A dedicated unit, known as the Prisoner of War Special Projects Division, was formed in 1944 to address the ideological fault lines among German POWs. This division operated under the direction of the Office of the Provost Marshal General and included military officers, academics, and German-speaking experts. Their mission: to identify, isolate, and counteract Nazi influence within the camps. Key to this effort was the classification of prisoners into 3 broad categories: A. Anti-Nazi or cooperative; B. Ambivalent or uncommitted; C. Hardcore Nazi loyalists. Category A prisoners were gradually relocated to separate facilities, such as Fort Kearny in Rhode Island, where they received access to democratic education programs, newspapers, films, and structured discussions on post-war Germany. This re-education initiative, while carefully avoiding overt propaganda, sought to challenge the authoritarian ideology many had grown up with. The Americans understood they could not erase beliefs overnight, but they could introduce alternative perspectives. Category C prisoners, by contrast, were often moved to high-security or isolated camps, where their influence could be monitored and contained. Internal hierarchies were quietly disrupted. Camp guards were instructed to minimize opportunities for group meetings. Suspected agitators were rotated between camps to prevent consolidation of power. Intelligence teams within camps, some composed of German-speaking Jewish refugees, gathered information and reported ideological threats, even as the U.S. tightened control. It continued to uphold Geneva Convention standards. Prisoners still received food, shelter, mail, and medical care. They worked the fields and, in most cases, were paid for their labor. But the tone within the camps had shifted. The veneer of calm was now underscored by watchfulness. Public perception also evolved. News of POW-related violence, including Kunz's murder and subsequent trials, reached American newspapers. Civilians who had once expressed cautious hospitality grew more guarded. The War Department issued stricter guidelines on interactions between POWs and civilians, particularly on farms. A balance had to be struck between upholding humanitarian values and containing a potential internal threat. By early 1945, with Allied victory in Europe approaching, the German POW system in America had become one of the most complex wartime operations on U.S. soil. It was no longer simply about housing the enemy. It was about managing minds, loyalties, and futures. The work of quiet containment, psychological observation, and controlled exposure had taken precedence. This was not a battlefield of bombs or rifles, but of belief. And in that quiet, ideological war, fought behind fences and farm fields, the United States had drawn a hard lesson. Even a defeated army could remain dangerous, long after it laid down its arms. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the German POWs, prisoners of war held in the United States, found themselves at a crossroads. Legally, under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were to be repatriated without delay after the cessation of hostilities. But in reality, the return of over 370,000 German POWs from American soil was anything but immediate. The Allied powers, facing the immense task of reconstructing a shattered Europe, chose to retain German prisoners for labor purposes beyond the war's official end. While most American-held POWs were eventually repatriated by mid-1946, many were first transferred to the custody of British and French authorities, where they were used to rebuild bombed infrastructure, clear rubble, and restore agriculture in war-torn areas. For many, captivity continued for another 1 to 2 years. In the United States, the camps were slowly demobilized. Branch camps closed first, followed by larger base camps. Military oversight was reduced, and prisoners were gradually consolidated in fewer locations for processing and transport. For most German POWs, the departure was bittersweet. Many had formed bonds with local communities, fellow prisoners, or even with the country itself. Some left with suitcases filled not with propaganda, but with books, letters, and photographs of American families who had shown them unexpected kindness. In Germany, their return was met with ambivalence. Those who came home early, particularly from Soviet captivity, were often traumatized, malnourished, or silent about what they had endured. By contrast, the American returnees, who had been well-fed, clothed, and in many cases intellectually stimulated, stood out. Some were mistrusted, seen as having had an easier war. Others were simply not believed when they recounted working on American farms or watching Hollywood films in camp recreation halls. Yet their stories mattered. Many of the returning POWs would later become influential in rebuilding West Germany's democratic institutions. A number became teachers, civil servants, or local leaders. Former POWs who had undergone re-education programs were often among the most vocal proponents of a Western-oriented post-Nazi Germany. Their exposure to American values, however limited or guarded, had left an impression. One former prisoner remarked years later, "They treated us as human beings. That made a deeper wound in me than any weapon could have." Meanwhile, in the United States, the memory of the German POWs faded quickly from public consciousness. By the early 1950s, most camps had been demolished or repurposed. A few sites remained, converted into parks, fairgrounds, or state facilities, but their wartime function became little more than a historical footnote. For those American communities that had hosted prisoners, recollections were often quietly proud. Farmers remembered the efficiency of the workers. Children recalled foreign songs drifting from behind fences. In some towns, small monuments or plaques were erected, not to glorify the prisoners, but to mark a moment in time when the enemy had lived among them, not in hatred, but in structured restraint. Not all memories were benign. Families who had lost loved ones in Europe or the Pacific often viewed the humane treatment of POWs as a painful contradiction. The war had cost the U.S. over 400,000 lives. That the enemy had eaten well, worked freely, and in some cases lived peacefully within the U.S. heartland struck some as unjust. But the policy held, not because it was popular, but because it was lawful. The broader consequences of this chapter were subtle but enduring. It became a case study in how a democracy could manage wartime enemies without compromising its legal and moral foundations. The POW camps had not only preserved life, they had tested the resilience of the American system under pressure. In doing so, they provided an early example of how post-war reconciliation could begin, not in treaties or trials, but in everyday human exchanges across barbed wire and farm fields. The story of German prisoners of war in the United States stands apart from the more violent, more visible theaters of the Second World War. There were no great battles fought behind the wire, no flags raised, no medals won. Yet, what unfolded within those quiet, fenced camps across the American heartland tells us something enduring, not just about war, but about restraint. At a time when the world was engulfed in total conflict, the United States made a conscious decision to treat enemy prisoners according to law, not vengeance. It was not always popular. It was not without flaws, but it was deliberate, and it mattered. By feeding, housing, and even employing enemy soldiers, the U.S. reaffirmed its commitment to the Geneva Convention not merely as a treaty, but as a statement of values. The POW system became a test, not just of logistics or policy, but of character. Could a democracy uphold its principles, even when confronted with the soldiers of a regime that had defied every moral boundary? The answer in this case was yes, and the result was quiet but profound. Thousands of former German prisoners returned home with an image of America not shaped by bombers or battlefields, but by farmers, camp guards, and simple human decency. In a war defined by extremes, by destruction, genocide, and ideology, this episode offered a contrast, a demonstration of what it meant to be governed not by hatred, but by rules, however imperfect. It also posed an enduring question: who are we when no one is watching? When the enemy is disarmed, defeated, and in our custody, what do we choose to show them? The United States chose to show discipline, structure, and in many cases, surprisingly, humanity. In the end, this quiet chapter of World War II left no monuments. But for those who lived it, on both sides of the wire, it remains unforgettable.